This story is based on official reports and eyewitness accounts, and this is the story of Sriwijaya Air Flight 182. In the afternoon of January 9, 2021, at Soekarno-Hatta International Airport in Jakarta, Indonesia, 56 passengers and 6 crew members were preparing to board a Boeing 737 operated by Sriwijaya Air, with the destination set for Pontianak, Indonesia, which is a 90-minute flight. The passengers boarded the plane without knowing that a dangerous situation was developing. Since its establishment in 2003, Sriwijaya Air has had a solid history and an excellent track record, with no fatal accidents. Despite being relatively unknown outside of Indonesia, the airline has maintained a good safety record over its 17-year history. Papa Kilo Charlie Lima Charlie is the registration name of the Boeing 737-500 aircraft that Sriwijaya Air is using to operate this domestic flight service. In 1994, Continental Airlines received the Boeing 737-500 aircraft. On May 15, 2012, Sriwijaya Air bought the plane from Continental Airlines. The cockpit of the plane had 2 pilots. The captain, Afwan, who was 54 years old and had a vast amount of experience with nearly 18,000 flying hours throughout his career, with 9,000 of those hours being on the 737. However, as we will later learn, experience alone is not always a reliable indicator of proficiency. Seated to the captain's right was the first officer, Diego Mamhit, who was 34 years old and had 5,000 flying hours, most of which were on the 737, except for his initial training. Both pilots had received training a few months prior for a specific type of emergency that they would have to handle on this particular day. However, we will delve into why this training proved to be insufficient in a moment. Additionally, there were other deficiencies on board the plane, apart from the inadequate training. As the 2 pilots prepared the plane for takeoff, rainstorms began pouring down on the aircraft and the surrounding area. While it was not an ideal day for flying, such weather conditions were not unusual for Jakarta during the month of January. Due to heavy rain in Jakarta, the takeoff for the 90-minute flight was delayed. After several minutes, Sriwijaya Air Flight 182 was finally given clearance by air traffic control to push back from the gate. Up to that point, everything appeared to be routine. After pushing back from the terminal, the aircraft received clearance to taxi to runway 25 right. The captain was responsible for piloting the aircraft to Pontianak, while the first officer was tasked with monitoring the aircraft's systems and communicating with air traffic control. At 2:36 p.m., the captain initiated the takeoff by pushing the engines to full power, and the plane started to accelerate down the runway. The takeoff appeared normal as the captain lifted the aircraft into the air and started climbing towards the west of the airport. At the time of takeoff, there were no extreme weather conditions, but a cumulonimbus cloud of about 15 kilometers high was present around the airport with moderate to heavy precipitation. As the plane climbed, the first officer contacted air traffic control to inform them that they were following their standard departure route. The controller cleared the crew to climb to 29,000 feet, which was a relief for the pilots as it would lighten their workload during the initial climb out, which is a busy phase of the flight. As the plane climbed, the captain turned on the autopilot and auto throttle at an altitude of 1,800 feet. This meant that the aircraft was now being flown completely by the autopilot. Let's take a short break. We've put a lot of effort into this video, and if you find it useful and informative, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support helps us bring you more great content. Thanks for watching. The pilots noticed rough weather on their weather radar as the plane turned northeast along its departure route. They decided to turn away from the storm by engaging the heading select mode of the autopilot. As the aircraft climbed, something significant occurred. This was not the first time this had happened to this particular aircraft, as it had occurred on numerous occasions in previous years. The pilots were not commanding the plane to climb or accelerate aggressively, resulting in the auto throttle not needing to demand as much power from the engines. As a result, the auto throttle began pulling the throttle levers back, but unfortunately, the right-hand lever became stuck. The auto throttle system on the plane had a history of occasional jamming during similar circumstances. The airline tried cleaning the electrical connectors and replacing suspected faulty components, but the problem persisted. While this had not caused any serious issues on previous flights, this time it would be different. As the plane accelerated, the auto throttle system tried to reduce engine power. However, the right throttle lever was stuck, so the right engine remained at a high power setting. To compensate, the auto throttle pulled back the left throttle even further. This created a split throttle, where one lever was much higher than the other. This had happened before on other flights, but it became a problem this time. The plane's auto throttle system got stuck, causing one engine to remain at a high power setting and the other to reduce power. Pilots needed to notice the problem and fix it themselves by pulling the right engine lever back. But it was hard to do because the autopilot was flying the plane and controlling both the thrust levers and control column. While flying, the pilots noticed a storm cell on their weather radar and requested to turn the plane to avoid it. They were granted permission by air traffic control and adjusted the autopilot to turn the plane away from the storm. During this time, the left thrust lever continued to move back while the right lever remained stuck. The pilots could have also noticed the discrepancy in power settings by looking at the engine instrument displays in the center of the cockpit, where they would have seen that the left engine was spinning faster and using less fuel than the right engine. The pilots were instructed by air traffic control to level off at 11,000 feet due to another plane in the area. They programmed the altitude into the autopilot, but the left engine lever continued to move back while the right engine lever remained stuck. If the difference in engine power became too great, the plane would start to turn to one side. The two pilots were unaware of the split throttles and the left-hand turn the plane was taking. Despite the opportunity to observe these issues had they been monitoring their engine instruments and attitude direction indicator, respectively, had they been paying attention to these cockpit instruments, they would have noticed the power imbalance and the discrepancy between the intended right-hand turn to a heading of 0.75 and the actual left-hand turn. Following the left-hand turn, air traffic control instructed the pilots to climb to 13,000 feet. The captain attempted to set this altitude on the autopilot, but as he did so, the aircraft unexpectedly banked to the left at a steep angle of 37 degrees. The automated voice of the 737 warning system alerted the pilots to the danger.
Bank angle, bank angle, bank angle.
The sudden warning caught the pilots off guard, as they had been unaware of any issues up to that point. The captain quickly responded, but he made a crucial error in judgment. Upon seeing the control column turn to the right, and knowing that he had programmed the autopilot to turn right, he assumed that the warning was related to an excessively steep right-hand turn. However, the opposite was true, and his action of grabbing the control column and banking the plane further left rolled the aircraft into an extremely steep left-hand turn. As a result, the plane started to fall, and the captain had to struggle with the aircraft to try to regain control. The auto throttle disengaged during this ordeal. The pilots were now facing a critical situation where every moment was crucial for their survival. It took a whole 10 seconds for the captain to realize that the throttles were split, and he reacted by correctly pulling the right engine back to idle. However, by this time, it was already too late. At 2:40 p.m., only 4 minutes after taking off, Flight 182 crashed into the Java Sea. Resulting in the instantaneous death of all 62 people on board. Indonesia's Navy dispatched several ships, as well as helicopters and frogmen, to aid in the search and rescue efforts. The Indonesian Navy announced a few days later that they had successfully located the precise coordinates of the crash site. The Indonesian National Police dispatched 1 aircraft, 4 helicopters, 8 boats, and 50 divers to the crash site once the exact coordinates had been identified. The pilots had undergone mandatory upset recovery training a few months before the crash, but their training was insufficient to handle the situation they found themselves in. Despite having an electronic artificial direction indicator in front of them, which could have helped them determine the plane's position relative to the horizon and level the wings, the captain failed to use it and bring the plane out of its nosedive above the Java Sea. After investigating the crash, Indonesia's National Transportation Safety Committee made recommendations to prevent similar accidents, including developing guidelines for airlines to provide better upset recovery training to pilots. It is important for airlines to provide high-quality training and for pilots to follow it. By following these recommendations, we can hope to prevent this kind of accident from happening again. In memory of the 62 people who lost their lives in the Sriwijaya Air Flight 182 tragedy.